Well, good morning and welcome to the plasma membrane notes. So we're going to look at the third sort of portion of our note package for Bio 20. And we're going to look at the membrane, the cell membrane in detail and what it does to facilitate all of the functions of the cell. So first of all, let's do a little bit of review and look at all of the life functions that are performed by cells. And all of these life functions, as we will see, will be aided in one way or another by the cell membrane. Movement. The cell membrane can have things like cilia or flagella that we saw in our previous section with the organelles that can allow it to sort of move it back and forth. The cilia and the flagella have sort of this whipping motion that allow a cell to move. Let's say that it was a bacteria or a blue-green algae like a euglena. Okay. Growth. The membrane will expand and allow the cell to grow so that it can take in more nutrients. The intake of nutrients, again, the cell membrane will allow certain materials into the cell and at the same time also materials outside of the cell. So intake of nutrients and waste removal are also part of that function. Responses to stimuli, we're going to see that cell membranes have proteins on the surface that will sort of act as receptors. And so sometimes when certain chemicals are released by the cell, those proteins will serve as receptors. They will sense those chemicals and they will cause a response. Exchange of gases, we will see how carbon dioxide and oxygen and other gases can enter the cell. In reproduction, the cell membrane can rearrange itself to allow things like, for example, a sperm to enter the egg. Both of them are cells. They have cell membrane that surrounds them, and so the cell membrane can allow that to happen. Okay? So we see that all of the activities of the cell depend on the ability of its membrane to transport raw materials into the cell, transport anything that it makes, so manufacture products and wastes out of it. But also we need it to be a protective layer. So we want to prevent any unwanted matter from entering the cell. Our immune system does a really great job at that, and the cell membrane is sort of a first line of defense of not letting things in and prevent the escape of matter. So once nutrients or materials that we need inside the cell enter, we want to make sure that they're not allowed to exit. Now, when it comes to the membrane structure, what we're going to see is that it is known as a fluid mosaic model. Fluid because it is sort of this fluid material that can bend and twist. It's not a rigid material. And mosaic because it's made of many different components. As you'll see here, we have sort of the main area of the membrane is going to be made of these little things called phospholipids, which we're going to check them out in just 1 second. And then you're going to have things like membrane proteins that are found right inside the membrane. You're going to find proteins that are found just on the surface of the membrane. You're going to have these proteins that are going to make channels that are going to allow things in and out of the membrane. And then you're going to find things like cholesterol. These little yellow structures that you see here is cholesterol, and cholesterol will give a rigidity, a little bit of structure to the cell membrane so it doesn't collapse. Okay, but when I want you to look at the cell membrane, I always want you to think about the extracellular fluids. So this is the outside of the cell, and the cytoplasm, this is the inside of the cell. Okay, and so I left a little bit of room here. We have this phospholipid bilayer. So this is a bilayer. Bi means two. So it is a two or a double layer, two-sided layer made of phospholipids. Okay, so what is a phospholipid? A phospholipid is a little structure that looks like that. Okay, and that's what you can see right up here. You can kind of see them. So here's one with its little tail, And you're going to see that there's another one with its little tail like that. Okay, so that's a phospholipid. And a phospholipid has a phosphate head. So phosphate, remember, it's PO4 3 negative, so it has a head that has a PO4 3 negative, okay? And then it has a lipid tail. Okay, lipid is another word for fat. And so the thing about this phospholipid is, since you have a phosphate head and a lipid tail, what you get is you get a molecule that is hydrophobic on one side, doesn't like water, and you have hydrophilic on the other. So the phosphate here is hydrophilic, so it likes water, whereas the fat is hydrophobic. Phobia means fear, okay, and we're gonna write it on here, so I just wanted you to have that, okay. So each phospholipid molecule has a hydrophilic water-loving head and a hydrophobic water-fearing tail. Okay. So when I get these two, I'm going to bring your attention up here. We're going to continue up here. So when I look at that phospholipid bilayer, what I get is I get one of these little tails like this, one of these little tails like that, okay? And they line up to make the membrane. And so the outside of the cell, which contains water, is fine because this part right here is hydrophilic. It likes the water. The inside of the cell, which has the cytoplasm and it also has water, is okay because this side is also water loving. But it is the middle, it's this middle portion right here that ends up being hydrophobic because it's got those two lipid tails. And therefore, if it's hydrophobic, if I have a material that is dissolved in water that wants to come in, it is okay to come in here. So if I have something that wants to come in here, it can go here. But if it doesn't dissolve in fat, it stops it right there. It can't go through. And the same thing on the outside. If I have another material that is, again, soluble in water, it's okay to go through here. But then as soon as it gets to the fat, it stops right there. So you can see how the cell membrane can prevent things from coming in and out just from its structure, okay? Now, together with that layer of, we said we have this layer of phospholipids, we have other things that are found in the membrane, and these are proteins, okay? So proteins, I'm going to change color here, so just to make sure we don't, okay, are embedded throughout the membrane. And they serve several functions depending on what they need to be doing, depending on their position, okay? So protein position within a membrane will make a difference in the job that they have to do. So a peripheral protein, these ones are loosely attached to the surface of the membrane. They actually can be found on either side. Okay. And a lot of times, so I'll show you those ones. So here we have those peripheral proteins right here. You can find them on this side or you can find them on this side. Okay. And a lot of times these guys will have the purpose. So we say here can be found on either side of the cell membrane. And a lot of times they will serve as markers for recognition. So when cells have to recognize other cells. For communication, sometimes what the cells will do is they will release certain chemicals to communicate with other cells. And so here, another word that we could use is we could have receptors. Okay, so I'll give you an example here. So if I have a cell that releases certain chemicals, and then on another cell, I have a little protein, and the chemical that has been released has to go into that particular receptor in order for, let's say, the cell membrane to open and allow chemicals in, okay, or for the cell membrane to change shape, or for the cell membrane to release another chemical on itself, so that it's sort of like a chain reaction kind of thing, okay? So then that would be, this would be, I'm just going to do it in this color. So that would be the receptor, okay, that receives a chemical from one cell in order to cause a response in another, okay? Then we have integral proteins. Again, I'm going to change color here just to make sure that we don't confuse the notes, okay? So these guys they're integral because they are found within the entire membrane itself. Okay, so they could make things like channels, like we see here, or here is one that you can see goes through the entire membrane itself. Okay, so integral proteins, so these guys extend through the entire bilayer. And they can form transport channels, that allows certain materials chemicals, water-soluble molecules, water-insoluble molecules that can't make it through the fat, right? So if I have a molecule that can't make it through the fat right here, then what I can do is I can put a channel in it, like I have here, where a molecule can go in. Okay, so if it can't make it through the phospholipid bilayer. Okay, so we have the transport, okay? So they allow those chemicals to come in, substances to cross the membrane. And then we have cholesterol. So cholesterol, these are molecules that help stabilize the cell membrane. By immobilizing the tails of the phospholipids. So So we have these phospholipids that have these fat tails, and so because they're made of they're made of fat, they can be quite squishy and they can move around and they can collapse. But if I were to take some cholesterol and sort of build a little wall there, then there's only so much that those little lipid tails can collapse. So I'm immobilizing them, I'm stabilizing them. And so cholesterol, a lot of people always associate it with being bad, but cholesterol is something that is actually needed by cells. We need it in order to stabilize the cell membrane so it doesn't collapse on itself like a balloon. Okay? So we have this fluid mosaic model. We said that it is fluid. We have the double layer that is soft and flexible so that the molecules can move and exchange places with one another. They don't always stay in position. I'm going to show you a little video later. And cell membrane molecules can be in constant motion, which results in good things. So we have the cell membrane that is flexible. If you think about your skin, for example, and you press down on your hand with your finger, those cell membranes are flexible. They're moving out of the way. If they were solid, they could pop. And at that point, it would create damage. So we want the cell membrane to be flexible, to be able to move around, okay? We want the cell to be able to change shape. And we also want the cell to have the ability to reseal itself if damaged or punctured. So it's good that we have that. And then we said that it is mosaic because it is made up of different components. It's made up of different components. With specific functions. That help the membrane perform its duties. So everything that the membrane has to do, we talked about, it helps with things like the movement and the growth and the intake of nutrients of the cell. So we have all of these components that are going to help out with that. Okay? So let's see, we said the duties of the cell membrane. What are these functions? We know, first of all, that the cell membrane is a biological barrier. It has to separate the cell from this ECF. ECF stands for extracellular fluid. So this is the outside of the cell. So when we were drawing this and I said the outside, you can see here the name that they have for it is that extracellular fluid. Okay. So we have to separate the inside of the cell from the outside, but also the extracellular fluid contains things like nutrients and hormones and oxygen, all of the things that the cell will need to survive. Okay? And then it holds products like proteins that other cells might have made and waste that, again, other cells might have made or itself has made. Okay? So, oops. When you're talking about products, proteins are products that certain cells will produce. Waste is CO2, is given off by all cells. Okay, anytime that they perform any function, CO2 is a waste product that is produced. Okay, and most organelles will have a membrane around them. Okay, membrane-bound organelles is one of the functions that we saw of eukaryotic cells. Okay. So the membrane is flexible and protects the cell against abrasions abrasions is like trauma, right? So if I hit my hand against the desk, I'm gonna be protected there. It's not gonna just all the contents of my cell are gonna, flow out, okay? And also from invaders. Other cells like bacteria or, pathogens of any kind. Viruses are not quite cells, but also protects from things like viruses, okay? The cell membrane also helps with recognition. I told you that certain cells have to recognize other cells, foreign cells, and other substances that might be needed by the cell, like hormones, neurotransmitters, or chemicals that help your nervous system communicate. Enzymes, these are things that are going to speed up reactions. Antibodies that are going to help you fight invaders, okay? So in a way, the membrane has to be a selective filter. It has to be semi-permeable or selectively permeable is another way of saying that. It has to recognize that some materials can come in, and it has to allow them to. And then it has to recognize that certain materials either too big or they're foreign and therefore have to be kept out, okay? So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at transport across the cell membrane. And we're going to look at different kinds of transport tomorrow. But for today, how does transport across the cell membrane occur? Well, there are two things that are going to influence transport. The first one is Brownian motion. Brownian motion just says that particles are always in constant random motion. They're continuously colliding with one another, whether that be in a liquid or in a gas. In a solid, the particles are too close to one another, and so that Brownian motion is very, very low. They say the particles are still vibrating in a solid, but it's so small, that movement, that is imperceptible, okay? So in a liquid or gas, particles are in constant, random motion. So they're constantly colliding with one another. Okay. And so if you have that, particles are always moving around, and so they're going to find themselves at the cell membrane, ready to either come in or out. So what decides then the movement of coming in or out? Well, that's going to be the concentration gradient. A concentration gradient is the difference in concentration of molecules. So that could be a gas or a solid or a liquid, it doesn't matter. It could be the concentration of oxygen or the concentration of proteins. So the difference in concentrations of molecules between two areas. Okay. So that's the gradient. You're going to have an area that has more and an area that has less. That's what that word gradient, okay, comes from. And so the path of movement of concentrations is molecules is always down a concentration gradient. Okay. So molecules tend to move down a concentration gradient. What does that mean? What that means is they always will go from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Okay, if somebody in the cafeteria opens up a bag of popcorn, what you'll find is the smell of popcorn will diffuse through the cafeteria. You can smell it into the hallway, and sometimes even into the English classrooms, right? So that's what happens. You have the area of high concentration is the cafeteria, right outside the microwave oven. But as soon as that popcorn bag is opened up, then those molecules, those scent molecules of the popcorn, will move from an area of high concentration, the bag, to an area of low concentration, which is the English hallway. Okay? And so this state of equilibrium is the state at which molecules are evenly distributed, and that's what they want. Okay? The concentration is equal throughout the medium. So why are they moving? Well, they're moving because those molecules are colliding with one another. The Brownian motion is there, and then that concentration gradient, to the fact that molecules always tend to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration until they're evenly distributed. They will continue to move like that until we have what is known as equilibrium. So until equilibrium is reached, that transport or that molecule will keep moving. Okay, now next time we're going to look at the different types of transport across membranes, and you guys have already the package for that. You can again follow in the textbook, or you can wait for the video. I'm going to post the videos together with that so that you can work on it together with the textbook. Okay, so we'll see you later on at our Google Meet, and